Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe. My granddad was raised on a chicken farm outside Krakow, Poland. He died a few years ago, at the age of 82. He sat me down next to him in his old rocking chair a few days before his death from an aggressive form of stomach cancer and said in his characteristic Polish accent, "After I took the boat to New York, I pledged to leave this narrative behind." He didn't glance up as he spoke to me, instead peering into his black coffee cup. "It's been 70 years, and I owe it to someone to tell them before I meet God. I was born in a little, quaint, uninhabited village that, under Nazi rule, continued to function. My father, mother, and brothers Frank and Sam all lived in this 2-bedroom farmhouse. I'm sorry you never had the opportunity to meet any of them. Anyway, Frank and Sam were twins, identical twins, to be exact, and we'd heard about the Nazi obsession with identical twins. This caused us to be even more reclusive, despite the fact that we already lived in a secluded corner of the countryside, in the town's last occupied house. To avoid visiting the occupied towns, we ate only chicken and eggs for every meal, along with whatever else Mama could gather from the garden. It was lonely, but we made it. The fact that I had to sleep in the basement was the most difficult thing for me. Michelle and Sam needed my father and mother's attention because they were toddlers. The basement was frigid, with only a small window, and the moonlight was my sole source of illumination. As a result, I always waited until I was completely exhausted before going down there, so I wouldn't have to lie awake. On evenings when I couldn't sleep, I'd glance out the window, which provided a little view of the garden and the enormous, abandoned water well. Throughout those lonely war-torn nights, this was my everyday activity. In general, it was dull and uninteresting, but every now and then, I'd get a glimpse of a family, or perhaps just a man, or two lovers, sneaking their way through our garden and up to our front door. They constantly appeared harried and terrified, and they sometimes wore ragged uniforms. Then there would be horrific hammering and begging for whoever lived there to open up, followed by an argument between my father and mother about whether we should let them in. He adjusted himself on the chair. "You see, son, we didn't realize, or at least I didn't, that we lived close to the Auschwitz concentration camp and that those folks were escapees." "Did your father allow them in?" I inquired eagerly. "No," he replied. "It would have been a death sentence for both of us. The Nazis didn't like Poles, but they accepted us, because hiding Michelle or Sam was easier than hiding a full family. My father did whatever it took to keep his family alive. As the battle progressed, less and fewer people began to appear in the middle of the night. That's when our chicken and vegetables started to go missing. Losing our only source of food would not have been acceptable, and my father assumed it was the escapees at the time, so he built a fence around our farm. Regardless, the hens continued to vanish. They weren't slain, they simply vanished. They simply vanished from their cages and pens. I decided to stay up late one night to see if I could locate the answer. I fought my sleepiness until the early morning hours, and despite the bad lighting and rain, I caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a human figure running across the lawn. I dashed upstairs to inform my father, and he dashed outside with the strongest home defense weapon we could afford, but we found nothing. No one. However, the next day we discovered something. Footprints. The path from the chicken coop to the water well. They were built in moist mud from rain, and they were made with bare feet. There are no shoes. There are no socks. Only feet. My father showed mercy on the man seeking refuge and sent him a note stating that he had 2 days to leave before he began sealing the well. I waited nervously for my grandfather to inform me of the man's fate. The next night, I had the idea to take a blanket down the well to the man because winter was approaching. I waited till my folks were asleep before sneaking out. I yelled something friendly down the well, assuring the poor fellow that my intentions were good, and started down the well, clinging hand and foot to the pegs fastened to the stones. As I got closer to the bottom, I smelled something horrifying and drew my father's flashlight from my pocket to shine it on the man. It was only then that I realized how huge the well was, having formerly supplied water to the entire town and its people. Families that no longer exist. But all I found was a hole, not a guy. A break in the stone where the well's wall had fallen, opening up to some kind of chasm just 2 meters wide, 3 meters deep, and 3 meters tall. Inside was not just a guy, but an entire family, of which only a skeleton-like monster survived. Its sunken eyes and gray skin reflected the light. Blood covered its face, and chicken carcasses were strewn about, a pile of dead poultry beside a lady and what I assumed were her son and daughter, children no more than 5 years old. They appeared to have been dead for weeks. The man, if he could even be called that, merely stared at the light, and I stared back, unable to break his focus. I didn't feel threatened by him because he lacked any aggression. He simply crouched immobile and silently next to the putrefying carcasses of his loved ones and the chickens that must have been his source of water because their meat was uneaten. He was devoid of whatever it is that makes us human. He should have understood his family members had died a long time ago, but he was still taking food to their graves. He was unable to accept it. When I shone the light back upon his daughter's corpse, he finally turned his head. He glanced at her, then sat closer to her and resumed his vigil. "You can go now," I told him. "I'll open the gate for you so you may flee. In the morning, my father will seal the well. Please depart right away." My young voice and suggestions had no influence on him. At that point, I figured it would be best if I just climbed back up the well and left, hoping the man would follow and escape. I flashed the light on him one more time as I began my ascent. "Grandpa, what did you see?" I shivered. I noticed a tear fall from his eye. He'd regained his manhood. He was only able to break free from the hallucination after witnessing his daughter's body, which had previously been shrouded by darkness. He understood then that he had been giving food to corpses rather than his family. That night it rained again, but when my father returned to plug the well in the morning, I noticed no footprints leading out of it.